It's being reported this evening that President Biden has lifted restrictions on Ukraine using US weapons to strike deeper inside Russia. President Zelensky has been pushing Western allies to allow his forces to use the missiles. It's believed the decision could help shift momentum in the conflict.
In the updated version of the document, aggression against Russia by any non-nuclear state, but with the support of a nuclear state, is proposed to be considered as their joint attack on Russia. Russia will also consider the possibility of using nuclear weapons when receiving reliable information about a massive launch of means of aerospace attack and their crossing of our state border. This includes strategic and tactical aircraft, as well as cruise missiles and drones, hypersonic and other delivery vehicles. Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in case of aggression, including if the enemy, using conventional weapons, poses a critical threat.
The plan to strengthen Ukraine is the Victory Plan, which I presented to our partners. One of its key points is long-range capabilities for our army. Today, there's a lot of talk in the media about us receiving permission for respective actions. But strikes are not carried out with words. Such things are not announced. Missiles will speak for themselves. They certainly will.
U.S. President Joe Biden has authorized Ukraine to use U.S.-supplied long-range missiles for strikes deep inside Russia. This major policy shift comes after months of requests by Ukraine and just 2 months before President-elect Donald Trump takes office. Trump has criticized Biden's strong support for Ukraine.
Deborah, it is a significant shift. It's something that President Zelensky has been calling for a long time.
It's a hugely important moment and a massive boost for the Ukrainians. Like you said, the Ukrainian president has been lobbying hard with the United States to try to get the US president to lift restrictions specifically on long-range missiles after months of deliberating over whether or not he was going to allow the Ukrainians to use these long-range army tactical missile systems. They are ballistic missiles launched from ground-based systems against targets inside Russia, something that the Americans seem to have been hesitant to allow, concerned that it might then prompt an escalatory response by Russia.
A little bit of breaking news. We're hearing that the Russians are reporting that Ukraine has now used these attacker ballistic missiles. More on that later.
Yeah, it looks like an escalation is coming. Okay.
This morning, Ukraine fired U.S.-made missiles into Russia for the first time. That's according to officials in Moscow. The move comes just 2 days after President Biden gave Ukraine permission.
And a major escalation on the 1,000th day of the war. The attack comes just 2 days after the Biden administration gave Ukraine the green light to use the weapons against targets inside Russia. The White House policy change comes after North Korean troops were deployed to help drive Ukrainian soldiers out of Russia's Kursk border region. Overnight, Russian President Putin signed a new doctrine saying any major aerial attack against Russia could prompt reprisals with nuclear weapons. A spokesperson for Putin says this adds fuel to the fire.
This news comes a few hours after Russian President Vladimir Putin said the country has a right to respond to an attack like this one with nuclear weapons.
Putin has a new warning for the United States after President Biden authorized Ukraine to use long-range missiles supplied by the U.S. to strike inside Russia.
The Russian anti-missile system apparently downed 5 out of 6 of these missiles. And the Russian Defense Ministry says Ukraine hit Russia with these missiles.
Feels like a significant escalation. Does the U.S. and the U.S. actually, and President Biden gave the blessing to Vladimir Zelensky to use these very big missiles a couple of days ago. Does that come with the guarantee that if Russia escalates, the U.S. is there to protect them?
Well, I think that this is a slew of questions that we do not yet have the answers to, Francine. And just to recap some of the news that we just got in the last few minutes, because this all feels fairly significant, is what we got from Vladimir Putin was signing into a decree allowing Russia to fire nuclear weapons in response to any kind of massive conventional attack on its soil. That would include drones, that would include presumably long-range missiles, that Russia would view aggression against itself or its allies by non-nuclear state backed by other nuclear powers as a joint attack. in summary, basically saying that if there was an attack on Russia by a member of a coalition that will be seen as an attack by sort of the full coalition, i.e., even if it's a non-nuclear power aided by a nuclear power, that would be seen as a joint attack. This is something that Putin has been talking about signing into as a decree since September. This is officially happening now.
The fact that we knew that Ukraine were going to be able to use these missiles in a slightly different way, was certainly with a further reach. This perhaps comes as no surprise. The fact that Russia says that these missiles have been used, can we believe them here?
It's extraordinary because of the pace here. I'm not sure it's necessarily unexpected to some degree, because we have known that Ukraine have been in possession of ATACMS missiles like this to hit targets inside of occupied areas of Ukraine. And so in theory, I suppose the target list would have already been in their possession, and this simply being a matter of Kiev deciding that they wanted to use this new US permission. But it comes on the 1000th day of a war so full of unexpected moments here, and I think we are now going to have to see whether Ukraine steps forward and officially acknowledges that this indeed was an ATACMS missile launching this particular strike. Just in the last 48 hours, President Volodymyr Zelensky has sort of hedged that, generally saying, look, we're not going to necessarily announce this. Missiles will speak for themselves. Well, certainly that news has indeed emerged. What could Russia's response be? They have been unclear at this particular point, previously warning that if these missiles were fired by Ukraine, supplied as they are by the United States, that would essentially be NATO, the US and Europe joining the war, becoming a party to the conflict. Putin has not reiterated that himself since this, but indeed his foreign ministry made similar noise. So it's a key moment here, certainly.
Vladimir Putin appearing to threaten to use nuclear weapons if Ukraine fires American-made missiles into Russia. The Kremlin saying the doctrine was updated in response to what it calls the new situation. The new Russian policy essentially authorizes the use of nuclear weapons in response to what it calls, quotes, critical threats of aggression using conventional weapons. Now remember, President Biden lifting restrictions on the ATACMS ballistic missiles, which are, of course, conventional weapons, essentially allowing them to be fired into Russia. Putin has made nuclear threats before that have proved to be hollow. A senior Ukrainian military source telling me this is blackmail, but also warning nuclear weapons are a Pandora's box that shouldn't be opened. This move likely aimed as much at President-elect Trump, who's promising to end the war when he takes office.
Then what we saw was Putin signing this declaration, revising the nuclear doctrine that you mentioned, that would it basically declared that a conventional attack on Russia by any nation supported by a nuclear power would be considered a joint attack. And then we see Ukraine using these long-range missiles. It's yet to be seen what Russia's response will be, but this would obviously be seen as quite an escalation by Moscow.
Yeah, look, I mean, they saw the American decision as an escalation. The Americans saw the decision by Russia to station North Korean troops on the front lines as an escalation by Russia. And so we have that ladder, people continually climbing.
France and the UK are considering sending troops to Ukraine as part of a European coalition. French officials say all options remain on the table, especially with U.S. aid under question as President-elect Donald Trump prepares to take office in January. Talks between London and Paris have intensified, focusing on the creation of a European defense coalition to support Ukraine to counter concerns over risks of further Russian advancements. NATO says Russia's ground forces have grown since the war began, and Moscow has increased aerial attacks and missile launches. In response, the UK has announced its largest sanctions package yet, targeting Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers used to evade Western restrictions. British leaders are urging allies to ensure Ukraine has the resources to sustain its defenses through 2025. Now NATO is preparing for emergency talks, and France says it may provide long-range weapons.
Vladimir Putin is making moves again. The war in Ukraine is escalating. Russia has launched a sweeping attack with new and deadlier weapons. And the Russian president is blaming the West for this escalation.
As we have repeatedly emphasized, the regional conflict in Ukraine provoked by the West has acquired elements of a global character.
But now the situation in Ukraine is worsening. Looks like the war will intensify before it ends, and it will have casualties not limited to Russia and Ukraine.
Zelensky saying we'll use all of these and calling on other NATO countries for similar support. But Russia warning it'll respond.
We will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia.
Ukraine discussing how all the embassies are shutting down. Embassies don't close unless there's some valid intelligence that's indicating something is coming. So again, I think there's a limited tactical application. It's primarily focused on holding Kursk. Outside of that, though, we're now going into this phase of escalation, and you can anticipate as we're moving with 7 weeks prior to the change in administration, you should anticipate, we should all be anticipating escalation on both sides.
The Kremlin, though, seems to be stoking fears of an escalation. Vladimir Putin approved a change in Russia's nuclear doctrine yesterday, lowering the threshold for a nuclear strike.
We're teetering on the brink of World War III, and a lot of people don't see it, but I see it, and I've been right about a lot of things. They all say Trump's been right about everything.
Russians have weapons to the Houthis. The Russians were found to have a ton of new weapon deliveries in the Hezbollah tunnels. Why?
Well, obviously, this shows that all these conflicts are now getting interconnected. We see the North Koreans, Iran, and China getting more and more involved in Ukraine, backing up the Russians more and more involved in the region we are now discussing. So this means that we are really facing a global conflict. And this is posing a threat not only to us here in Europe, but also to the Americans and, of course, to Japan and South Korea, because Russia is paying for it. For example, by missile technology. And these missiles can then reach the American mainland. And that's a real risk. And we have to be very much aware of this.
World War III has never been closer than it is right now. We need to clean house of all of the warmongers and America last globalists and the deep, the Pentagon, the State Department, and the national security industrial complex.
I hope that they'll get to a peace agreement, but it has to be one that is more than just a ceasefire. It has to actually deliver a structure which can provide certainty for the nation of Israel and for the United States that this conflict won't rise again. And you know, the fact that we're talking about this after the election, when President Trump is about to take office, it shouldn't surprise anyone.
One of the reasons I was the only president in generations who didn't start a war is that I was the only president who rejected the catastrophic advice of many of Washington's generals, bureaucrats, and the so-called diplomats who only know how to get us into conflict, but they don't know how to get us out. For decades, we've had the very same people, such as Victoria Nuland and many others just like her, obsessed with pushing Ukraine toward NATO, not to mention the State Department support for uprisings in Ukraine. These people have been seeking confrontation for a long time, much like the case in Iraq and other parts of the world.
Victory in Ukraine look like? I don't know what it means. Like, I don't know. Is it just like perpetual death of Ukrainians and Russians until they're all wiped out and, you know, BlackRock comes in there and takes over all the farmland? I mean, is that what it is? Because feels like that's what it is to me.
They're already selling off land in Ukraine to foreign investors, and they will flood Ukraine with third world immigrants, and Ukraine will not exist in 50 years.
But what's really interesting is this tweet from Sir Keir Starmer yesterday. Take a look. Showing he's been sitting down with the world's largest asset manager, BlackRock, telling Britain that the only way to secure growth and create wealth is working with private mega wealth funds such as BlackRock. And if you don't know about BlackRock and how they operate, let me tell you a little bit about them. They're the world's largest asset manager with over $8.5 trillion in assets. They have their fingers in every pie you can think of: big pharma, big tech, farming, agriculture, government contracts, and even recently deals with Zelensky to rebuild Ukraine. Isn't that interesting? Their power is so huge that most of all the woke DEI quotas you see at companies all around the world almost certainly lead back to CEO Larry Fink and his company, BlackRock.
The RNC and the DNC don't want people talking about it because they're both paid by BlackRock. And BlackRock owns the processed food companies that are poisoning us. And they own the pharmaceutical companies that are making $4.3 trillion a year, 5 times our defense budget, treating the chronic disease that's being caused by BlackRock's other, group of companies. BlackRock owns all the military contractors, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Lockheed, et cetera, that are destroying all the ports and bridges and schools and, roads in Ukraine. And they also have the contract for rebuilding Ukraine. Right. So you have, both parties are being supported by BlackRock.